It's an honor and a pleasure for me to present in front of, in this webinar. I thank the organizers for this invitation, and I'll try to make as clear as possible the possible contribution of pragmatism to the development of organization studies, particularly organization studies on grand challenges. Maybe I could reformulate this title in a more general way, saying how pragmatism can advance organization studies on the development of society. Grand challenges being part of it, but I think it's a key contribution to the social problem solving and development of society. Now, just a personal word about it. How did I come to pragmatism? I think I should explain that I had a life history which mixed permanently theory and practice. I was a senior civil servant and advisor to ministers in France, in the French government, executive in a manufacturing company, consultant on organizational change, professor and researcher in the academic world, and I published, as you indicated, Pragmatism in Organization Studies in 2018. So to some extent, this entanglement of theory and practice in my life history prepared my encounter with pragmatist thought and pragmatist thinkers. Now I start my presentation with a piece of history.
Hi, thank you for tuning in. I am Mikko Katokivi.
I go back to 1872, more or less, in the United States, with 4 pictures. You see one picture of war, the Civil War in the United States. Second picture, the invention of telephone by Graham Bell. The third picture, the publication of Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, by means of natural selection. In the fourth picture, European immigrants arriving at Ellis Island in New York with this very important wave of immigration to the United States at the end of the 19th century. Why those 4 pictures? Because to some extent, I would say that they define what we could already call grand challenges at the end of the 19th century in the United States. Civil war, violence. The Civil War in the United States was a massacre, a slaughter, because more or less 1 out of 8 male adults were killed. It was the first industrial war. The second aspect, which is, of course, a military, political, and human shock in the country. The second picture is about a technological revolution, the invention of telephone, but the revolution is much broader than just the invention of telephone. The development of new steel process, dividing the cost of steel ton by 6, and in 30 years, multiplying the production of steel in the United States by a factor of 160. The very quick expansion of railways, of the railway network. So it was, I would say, a brutal technological and industrial revolution with positive aspects, of course, but also a danger for the natural milieu landscapes. And maybe it explains that Darwin's book not only was a shock, an intellectual shock for American citizens, because it said that the human species is not an exception. It's part of the general flow of evolution, integrated in natural milieu. And it also raised all kinds of worries about the deterioration of that natural milieu, with the first development of ecological thought in the United States, with works by Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, the publication of Walden, Life in the Woods, and the creation of the first national parks. The first one is Yosemite, which was first created in 1864 and developed and broadened in 1890. And the fourth picture was about massive immigration from Europe. 11 million immigrants arrived in the United States from 1870 to 1900. all that explains why maybe some 15 to 20 young Harvard scholars gathered in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They called themselves the metaphysical group, but it was, of course, an ironic name because they didn't want to do metaphysics at all. And they built the first foundation of pragmatism. Amongst them, the two first historical founders of pragmatism, William James and Charles Sanders Peirce. Their first ideas was, to some extent, we could say simple, in response to the pressing situation of society we've just seen and the natural environment. Thinkers and researchers cannot and must not and should not shut themselves away in an ivory tower. These young scholars rejected the idealist, rationalist tradition of European philosophy embodied in thinkers such as Plato, Descartes, Kant. They stated that situations and their disruptive power should be taken seriously. And thought should start from situations, from situated experience, and lead to the renewal or adaptation of experience. So for them, there was a key question in that situation, historical situation. What should we do? The future is uncertain and unpredictable, so that it was unavoidable to accept that any course of thought, any course of action is hypothetical, fallible, and should first be experimentally tested. And on the other side, I don't know if you have in mind, if you remember the metaphor used by Descartes. Descartes described a stick plunged into water. And he said, well, if you look at that stick plunged into water, because of the diffraction of light, you have the impression that the stick is broken. But we know that it is not broken. This is the proof that our senses cheat on us, that our body is not reliable, that our empirical experience is not reliable. So we must get rid of any kind of traces of empirical experience and sensual experience to start from logical, rational thinking. And the pragmatists go directly against this statement by Descartes, and they say that the rationalist mistrust of body, senses, and practical experience, and the idea that true logical representation should prevail over the ongoing flow of practical experience should be abandoned. At least for two reasons. One, it is that it is not possible to start from a white sheet. We always start from some kind of personal and social and cultural experience. And on the other side, it is not desirable because our empirical practical experience is the very basis of our relationship with the world. Now, Charles Sanders Peirce, one of the two founders, formulated what is called now the pragmatist maxim, saying that the meaning of a concept or a word is nothing else than the sum of its potential practical effects. Peirce said, give me a concept, whatever the concept. The concept doesn't mean anything else, anything less, and anything more than the sum of its potential practical effects. And this is the cornerstone, to some extent, of pragmatic thought. It leads to many consequences, one consequence being that the pragmatists reject the epistemology of truth as correspondence between rational representations and reality, the real world. And if they keep, some of them don't keep the word truth, they directly altogether reject the word truth. But for example, Peirce and Dewey speak of truth. And they say that truth is rather the capacity, individual and collective, but primarily, I would say, collective, social capacity, to adapt practices or to invent new practices in response to challenging new situations. And it doesn't mean that theories, logical models, logical representations should be abandoned, are useless. They recognize that theories, models, rational representation may be very useful tools, like hammers or shovels, i.e. as signs allowing understanding, debating, acting, rather than exact descriptions of reality. So, for example, Dewey tells us, well, a theory can be useful if it helps us to face the situation. If it doesn't help us to face the situation, we can drop it and move to something else. There is not this kind of mystics of true theories. Theories are viewed in their instrumental utility, usefulness. But of course, not in a utilitarianism view. It's not that theories should be considered as directly useful in daily situations. They can be useful in the general intellectual development of a society. As a result, also, Peirce tells us that tools can be representational signs, but they can be non-representational at all signs. For example, I give here two examples of signs, tools, which are not representational at all. One is the traffic light. Well, we all know that if the light is red, we should stop. But there is, of course, no representation of running or stopping in the traffic light. It's just based on a social convention. And a windsock, the windsock doesn't represent the movement of wind and so on. It's just a trace, a physical trace of wind. Even the map of London Underground you have on the right could seem more representational. It is more representational, of course, because it has some common shape with the actual network of London Underground. But we see that we don't expect from this tool to be only representational. It has colors. It is geometric. It is very much simplified because we expect from it to be useful in the action of a London traveler trying to travel in the network of London Underground. I just define three concepts which are key in the pragmatic thought, but in my first design of the presentation, I had included 6 concepts. I dropped 3. I dropped valuation, abduction, and community of inquiry. But I think those 3 are really the basic concept. First, habit. Habit is somehow experience. It is the form of experience, of social experience, cultural experience, individual experience. Habit is an experience-based predisposition to act in a certain way, in a certain type of situations. It's not a routine. As you know, routine authors have analyzed routines as combining performative and ostensive aspects, performative as effected action, and ostensive aspect as representational artifacts. But a habit is neither effected action nor a representational artifact. It's just dispositional. It's a cultural disposition for situated action. It is a resource for situated action. And for example, in a given situation in which you have to act, there may be several possible habits competing, or maybe only one which is rather obvious. But in any case, there is, before involving a habit in action, some kind of pre-reflection or reflection to determine that this habit or that habit can be useful to face that situation. It's a resource. Second, inquiry. Inquiry is triggered when habits are destabilized by new situations, when they fail in a new situation. So then, if habits fail, there is the need for a process of social search for new practices to face the situation. That search, that process of inquiry, is experience-based. It involves experience. But one of the difficulties of the inquiry is to try to define what parts of experience we should drop and what parts of experience we should use and maintain. It is a kind of groping in the dark. We explore. So it is exploratory, oriented to the future, trying to explore possible futures, potential futures. It is hypothetical. The inquiry has no possibility to reach absolute certainty. It remains hypothetical. And as it is a hypothetical, it has to be experimental. It has to test the hypothesis. There is no transcendental given in inquiry. Everything, rules, norms, theories, values, goals, can be questioned in the course of the inquiry and redesigned if so needed. There is no transcendental elements in the inquiry. And finally, transaction. All participants, humans, non-humans, concepts, objects, are immersed within the flow of the inquiry, and no inquirer can have an overlooking viewpoint. Mary Parker Follett speaks of the onlooker fallacy, the idea that there may be some kind of leader or scholar or model developer who can have an overlooking viewpoint over the situation and over the inquiry, the dynamics of change. This is not possible. We are all immersed within the flow of the inquiry. And the practical meaning of the situation, the practical conclusion of the inquiry is emergent, emerges from the transactional process. What are the implications for organizational research? There are many, but I will just mention 4. The first is that there is no universally relevant method. There is a kind of methodological opportunity that the choice of methods is contingent on the situation, the problem at stake, the available means, and we have to also try and experiment methods. Second, theories have a humble status as tools. They remain hypothetical. Maybe this theory is relevant to face these particular situations, but this is a hypothesis. And the validation of this hypothesis or the theoretical hypothesis can only be experimental. Hence, the importance of experimentation. And this humble status of theory leads to some kind of wisdom. I call it wisdom. It's the recognition that we must have proximity to the field and close attention to experience. I like this quote by Mitchell. Each new domain of knowledge appears simple from the distance of ignorance. And we are participants, not observers. And if we try to be distant observers, we are threatened by the illusion to find things simple. The third consequence for organization research is that the research should be based on a pluralist community of inquiry, which involves all the actors concerned by the studied issue as peer inquirers in a democratic approach. Peer inquirers, equal inquirers, whatever their social status and their organizational position, which requires political and technical conditions to build a community, which is not very simple. Dewey is not naive. he recognizes that for an inquiry to be fertile, to be fecund, productive inquiry, fruitful inquiry, there are difficult political and technical conditions to ensure about equality, liberty, freedom of speech, of expression, and so on. The whole community of inquiry is concerned by the results of research and by their validation. This is also a difficult condition because for us scholars, it is not always obvious to go back to other members of the community inquiry, in particular, for example, managers and so on, to exchange about the results of the research. And fourth consequence, there is a social responsibility of the researcher. And maybe of thinkers in general, not only researchers, but of thinkers. Thought research is transformative and should contribute to social development. Not only for ethical reasons. Of course, there are ethical reasons because we have moral responsibility to society. But Dewey develops epistemic arguments for this participation. He says that actually it's a condition to develop knowledge, knowing by doing, knowing from within. And but for this condition of participating, it will be very difficult for us to develop relevant knowledge about the situation we are analyzing. Very quickly, some examples, but I'll skip part of this slide just to say that I'm working on the application of pragmatist ideas to very diverse issues in organizational research. For example, on the notion of control. If control depends very much on the definition of control, but if control assumes compliance, separation between means and ends, some kind of a heteronomy of human activity, the idea that human activity should be at least partly designed and regulated from outside the activity, control may be problematic and somehow contradictory with the very idea of pragmatist inquiry. Research about the notion of profitability more recently. It's very interesting to see that Dewey was interested in the financial management of companies in his time, and that he said, well, profitability, the rate of profit, can be necessary indicators as tools serving the inquiry because to some extent they are measurements of economic effectiveness. But they become problematic if profitability is viewed as a transcendental value, which means that it transcends any other kind of performance. And thus, it crushes the possibility of pluralist inquiries, of dialogical contradiction, and so on. Third example, risk management. And I know that Carl Weiss is present. Disasters. I am an expert to the French nuclear authority, French Authority for Nuclear Safety. And I read a lot about disasters and major technological risk. And I see that disasters often happen when leaders excessively trust theoretical models and auditing procedures, more than the direct experience and warnings of field actors. And fourth example, the commons. I don't have time to develop. I think one of the texts I mentioned as a possible reading for this presentation was an article about the theory of the commons. Let us say that the problem of the tragedy of the commons, as it is often worded, tragedy of the commons, originally is defined by economists as an economic problem, as a resource allocation problem. But if you have a pragmatist perspective of the notion of commons, first of all, we replace commons with commoning. And maybe you replace commoning with exploratory inquiry, because the definition of resources, the uses of resources, the stakeholders who participate in the situation, what is the general interest, all of that is not given and remain open in the course of the inquiry. So the problem with the commons is more an issue of how to design democratically social practices rather than just a resource allocation problem. I don't know if I have time. Yes, maybe very quickly to give an example, a very simple example of inquiry in a hospital in the area of Paris, in Paris area, Pontoise Hospital. The context, it takes place in the cardiology department of the hospital. It's a big hospital in Paris area. And the cardiology department has the project of investing in an innovative cross-disciplinary unit to treat chronic heart failure. But to treat chronic heart failure for outpatients, patients who don't stay in the hospital. And it is intended to be cross-disciplinary, involving, of course, cardiologists, but also general practitioners, also specialists of food and diet, and a specialist of physical exercises, and so on and so on. But they need funding from the French state. And the French state gives funding only if the cardiology department proves to be effective, economically effective in treating chronic heart failure. And unfortunately for them, the average CHF cost is today higher than in the average hospital in France. So they will probably be denied the required funding. So they establish a community of inquiry to try to understand why they are more expensive than the average hospital in France. And the community of inquiry involves cardiologists, cardiology nurses, technicians, hospital managers, an organization scholar, and the medical information director, who is a physician who knows the information system, the medical information system of the hospital, and can bring advice on, for example, the use of statistics, medical statistics. And the hypothesis they discuss, they have a debate and so on, and they reach a hypothesis, a shared hypothesis. Pontoise Hospital has advanced sonogram testing methods, which in that time, it was 15 to 20 years ago, it's an old example I experienced. They have advanced diagnosis methods, which are costly, but provide an accurate diagnosis. They are economically costly, but medically very relevant. And it happens that there is a minority of CHF patients who are admitted in the hospital in other clinical departments than cardiology. It's estimated at 8% more or less of CHF patients, mostly multi-pathologies. That's why they are supposed to be in other clinical departments. And those do not benefit from sonogram testing methods. So the hypothesis is that it's a control sample and the average cost should be lower. So let us compare CHF costs in the two populations. And they have two surprises. First surprise, the percentage of CHF patients who are admitted in other departments than cardiology is much higher than expected. It's not 8%, it is around 25% of CHF patients. And the second surprise is that the average cost of CHF patients is much lower in the cardiology department with advanced technologies than in other departments. And the problem of high cost entirely comes from the other departments. So they have discussions about these surprising facts, and they formulate new hypotheses. About the first surprise, they finally agree that probably CHF patients admitted in other departments than cardiology are not only multi-pathologies, but also CHF patients who were incorrectly oriented in the emergency department. patients who entered the hospital through the emergency department and were not correctly oriented. Because some symptoms can be confused. For example, difficulties to breathe. A patient who has difficulties to breathe, you can send the patients to the respiratory pathologies department, while actually it is a CHF patient, a chronic heart failure. The second hypothesis about the second surprise is that sonogram testing is expensive, but allows a quick, accurate diagnosis and thus a quick definition of the adequate treatment, and it shortens the stay in the hospital, which makes it less expensive. So there is a new step in the inquiry. The first hypothesis, to study the first hypothesis, they first ask the head of the emergency department to join the community of inquiry, to be part of it. So the community of inquiry widens to the emergency department. Second, they compare the percentage of CHF patients, and then they need statistics, the percentage of CHF patients who came through the emergency department in the cardiology department versus the CHF patients who came through the emergency department in other clinical departments. And the hypothesis is that probably there are more patients who came through the emergency department in the other clinical departments because the emergency department oriented them wrongly. To test the second hypothesis, first of all, they ask the heads of other concerned clinical departments, mainly respiratory disease and oncology, to join the community of inquiry. And they compare the length of hospital stay of the CHF patients in the cardiology department and in other clinical departments. Of course, the hypothesis that the hospital stay, the average stay of CHF patients is longer in the other clinical departments. Results, very quickly, the measurements on a period of, let us say, 6 months, more or less, seem to confirm the hypothesis. There are many more patients coming through the emergency department in the other clinical departments, and the length of the hospital stay of CHF patients is significantly lower in the cardiology department. Then they define experimental actions. On the first issue, they decide to implement an on-call duty, a permanent on-call duty of a cardiologist by telephone or physically present in the emergency department to reinforce the cardiology competence of the emergency department and to avoid mistakes in the orientation of patients. After a few months of application, it seems to work. And the second issue, sonogram testing shortened the hospital stays. The cardiology department will informally provide sonogram testing to CHF patients who are admitted in other departments in between the normal sessions of sonogram testing of the normal patients of the cardiology departments, kind of informal agreement. But that informal agreement, which from a medical point of view seems to work, raises all kinds of logistic, administrative, and accounting issues. Meals, who provides the meals to those patients when they are in the cardiology department? Cost, to what budget should sonogram testing for those patients be charged? Transport, where to find stretcher bearers to transport them? Then they decide that a logistician and an accountant must join the community of inquiry, and actually they have to widen the inquiry because those organizational processes raise issues of national procedures, accounting, conventions, and so on. So they have to contact the Ministry of Health. Well, I stop here, and just summarizing, I won't comment the content of the table. The only aspect of the table which I want to comment is the 6 columns. You see that there are 6 columns. The first column defines the trigger of the step in the inquiry. What issue is at stake? What problem should we solve? What is our doubt? The second column is on what hypothesis are we going to work? What is the working hypothesis to go on in the inquiry? The third column is the testing action. What action shall we implement to test our hypothesis? The fourth column is tooling. With what tools shall we test? What kind of statistical parameter? What kind of procedure, working procedure, and so on. The fifth column is the community composition, community of inquiry composition. With whom shall we make the testing and the analysis of the testing results? And the last column about the results of the experimentation. So this is, I think, it gives a good view of the different aspects of the inquiry. We see that the measurement of performance, of validity of hypothesis evolves in the course of the inquiry, hence the concept of valuation by Dewey. We don't have a fixed, as for example, profit rate. There would be a profit rate. Of course, there is the general CHF cost, which is a kind of starting and final measurement. But the CHF cost doesn't allow to do anything if we stop, if we remain just in this measurement. Well, ground challenges, I mentioned in title ground challenges. The ground challenges are characterized by their complexity, which means that there can be no overlooking observer. All humans, individuals, groups, institutions are immersed in the transactional complexity of ground challenges. And we see that nobody can give a kind of holistic model of ground challenges, for example, of biodiversity and climate change and their relationships and so on. Uncertainty. We see that the experts, the best experts, it's not their fault, it's like that, it's fact of life. The best experts, for example, about climate change are permanently surprised. Permanent surprises belie forecast, requiring ongoing inquiry and ongoing experimentation. Third aspect, the situation evolves, unfortunately for us, particularly on some issues such as biodiversity collapse or climate change. Evolutions are very quick. And that makes control difficult. You know, control as understood by managers, everything is under control. No, not everything is under control. I wouldn't say that nothing is under control because I don't want to be too pessimistic, but far from everything is under control. And habits must be constantly re-questioned, and the inquiry must constantly start on new basis. And last, the public of the inquiry, the community of the potential community of inquiry is very wide. According to the problem, it can be more or less the whole humanity. Of course, we cannot involve in a concrete process of inquiry the whole humanity, but it means that the pluralism is extreme and should be extreme. The representations of stakeholders should give some account of this extreme pluralism of viewpoints and competencies within inquiry. So 150 years later, after 1872 and the metaphysical group, I think there are a lot of similarities with the situation in the United States in America. Maybe our situation is even much more extreme than the one they had at the end of the 19th century. That's why I think that pragmatism is more topical than ever. just a few words to conclude. Who refers to pragmatism? I just give a very few examples of, to my mind, particularly conspicuous examples. And I prepared this much before knowing that Karl Weick would be in the audience. I give the example of Karl Weick working on the management of major risks, of extreme risks, and who involves explicitly or tacitly pragmatist concepts such as situated inquiry, explicitly abduction, for example, in the analysis of Bhopal disaster, and who emphasizes the contribution, the necessary contribution of scholars to the design of reliable practices, for example, defining what high reliability organization, HRO, are. Another example is Edward Freeman, the father of stakeholders theory. I heard once Edward Freeman saying, well, Dewey and Follett are my gods. I was quite interested in that statement. And I think that his stakeholders theory is very much inspired by pragmatist ideas about inquiry and the pluralism of inquiry, seeing the governance of organizations as a pluralist inquiry involving the diversity and the variety of stakeholders and avoiding that one viewpoint, for example, profitability, crushes, excludes the other ones. Another example is Bruno Latour. I exchanged with him in the last years of his life. He was more and more involved in the issue of ecological challenges. He emphasized that we should drop dualisms such as, of course, the social natural dualism. We should drop not rationality, but rationalism. With his paper about matters of fact versus matters of concern, and describing the robustness and solidity of matters of fact as a kind of illusion, and recommending to involve social groups into, and this is the title of one of his last books, Inquiries about the Modes of Existence. And the word inquiry for him was a very clear reference to Deweyan pragmatist theory of inquiry. Well, to conclude, I just mentioned that next year at IGOS, there will be a pragmatist sub-theme, and it will be hybrid. So for those interested amongst you, interested in participating, you can receive this link. I give it here with sub-theme 79, call for papers. And for those who want to go further with pragmatism, there are two upcoming mini webinars in the very next days to encourage submissions for IGOS 2025. The first is on November 11th about exploring methodology and epistemological borderlands through pragmatism. And the second one on November 18th about how pragmatism challenges the study of organization and design, the relationship between organization and design. If you are interested, you just have to click on the link I give here, and you will receive the calendar invitation. And there is also a research community, an international research community about pragmatism, which is very active, which organizes those many webinars, and IGOS sub-theme 79. And you can connect with that community by on the web through the first link I give here, or on LinkedIn through the second link, which is given here. Now, thank you for your attention. It's the end of my presentation. I adopted as an image for the end of the presentation. The image, it is nowadays, it's a painting which is presented in a big surrealism exhibition in Paris. I found it very interesting because it is the painting of a closet which is the very picture of closing, of shutting. But you see that when the doors of the closet are open, actually it opens to a new world, a new landscape, another place. And I think this is a very good image for the pragmatist inquiry, because the pragmatist inquiry is closing, reaching conclusions which will allow you to act. But on the other side, we know that the closing of the inquiry will be most probably, and most certainly, the beginning, the opening of a new inquiry in the next future. So closing is opening. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this insightful talk. We've been having a lot of discussions in the chat, a number of questions where I already felt like, oh, Philippe would be the right person to answer this. So may I ask the various people that have already asked questions in the chat, could you raise your hand so we can have your question again and see how Philippe reacts? Maybe I just start already with one that was asked in the chat while the rest is because I don't see a hand yet. There was a question maybe towards the beginning of pragmatism. What are the links to people like Emerson and Thoreau? So you mentioned that a bit, but maybe you could clarify a bit more. Were they building on pragmatism? Were pragmatists building on them? Is there some kind of relationship?
Yes, definitely. I think so. I think there were personal relationships between some of those people. I don't have the precise, I couldn't tell you, for example, that Thoreau and Dewey and James, for example, met in that opportunity and so on. But there were personal relationships on one side. And on the other side, I think that the ideas of Thoreau or Emerson are very much in resonance with at least one of the key concepts of pragmatism I mentioned, which is transaction and transactional inquiry. Because the idea of transactional inquiry, and there are parts of the book that Dewey and his colleague Bentley wrote about transactional inquiry. The title of the book is Knowing and the Known. Parts of that book are very directly judgments about the ecological integration of humanity, human beings, human actors, and the general milieu, particularly the natural milieu. And I think this idea was in the air, but it was very coherent with this idea of inquiry of pragmatists, inquiry in which there is no transcendence. There is a kind of general relational movement, transactional relational movement, including the natural setting, the natural environment. And Dewey, I think Dewey and Bentley explicitly criticize the word environment because they say it is not environment. We are part of it and it is part of us. Environment gives the idea that there is some kind of externality. So I think that between the ideas and acts of somebody like Henry David Thoreau and the ideas of, for example, Dewey, Mead, and Bentley, there are very many echoes, many relationships.
Fantastic. Are there any more questions? I don't seem to see them in the chat, or nobody's raising their hand. Let's give people a moment to dare to speak up. John, do you want to ask a question directly?
Yes, well, I can ask this question. Yes, my name is John. I come from Roskilde University in Denmark, and I'm very much inspired by François Corinne. I don't know whether you know his work, but I just been wondering about what are the roles of words in pragmatism, right? For instance, can you say that they can mean anything, or are they limited by something, right? For instance, you can take a typewriter and you may call it a flying machine if pushed in space, where it will then start moving, right? But on Earth, you may say that a typewriter is not a flying machine because gravity will make it fall if thrown out of the window, right? So can you can you explain to me the role of language and what puts limits to or the role of words and what put limits to the role of words in according to pragmatism? I mean,
Yes, you know that there is a whole tradition, or I would say stream of thought and research on one side in linguistics, on the other side in semiotics, who are inspired by pragmatism, more particularly by Peirce. By the way, I know François Corinne very well, and we wrote together a paper chapter about Peirce and communication approach to organizations and so on. I think that from a pragmatist viewpoint, words are a very interesting example of sign, what I mentioned as sign, because words traditionally were viewed as representing some object. And Peirce says, no, they are important, like other signs, as action triggers or action enablers. What kind of action do they trigger? What kind of action do they enable? Hence, the pragmatist school of linguistics, such as with people like Austin, for example, theorizing speaking as action, speaking as acting. Now, what are the limits? I think the limits of the meaning of a word are the limits we give it. If we decide that a word should or can allow this type of interpretation and action, I often give the example of a CEO, for example, meeting a collaborator, somebody who works for him, and who has just made a very big mistake, making the company lose an important customer. And the CEO receives that person and tells the person, congratulations. And you see that if you look in a dictionary, congratulation will never mean you made a big mistake. I will punish you in some way. I don't know if I will fire you or I don't know, but it is a disaster. But the situation participates in, it's like the London Underground map I showed. The situation participates in the meaning of the word as much as the formal definition we can find in the dictionary. So words are actants, to use Latour's word, actants in a transactional inquiry. They participate in inquiry. And if the word congratulations meets a situation in which there was a big mistake and the CEO is very angry, it will have a very different meaning from the classical meaning. I don't know if I answer your question.
Thank you. That's fine.
Patrick, I'll just call you up. Patrick Prince, do you want to maybe ask one of your questions? Because you've been very engaged in the chat. I don't want to like put you.
Okay. Hello, I'm Patrick, a PhD student at University of Bath. And one question I have is that you said that the Metaphysical Club wasn't concerned with metaphysics, but I think Peirce was deeply concerned with metaphysics, but it was misinterpreted by James and Dewey.
In
And
what
I was
sense?
wondering what your perspective is on that.
In what sense do you mean that he was deeply concerned by metaphysics?
I think he was because he was interested in Kant's idea of the thing in itself and phenomena, and he sought to bridge the two, and he did that by developing a metaphysical framework which was empirically observable and which alleviated phenomena onto the same plane as the thing in itself. I don't think James and Dewey adopted that idea.
Well, I think there were some disagreements between James and Peirce, undoubtedly. And Dewey, it's more complicated because Dewey changed. He lived quite long, which is a good thing, I think, because he was productive till the end of his life, incredibly productive. But in the course of his life, he changed his ideas, and particularly changed his ideas about Peirce, because in his first writings, he was much more Jamesian, more inspired by James. And towards the second half of his production, he started being more interested, I think, in Peirce than in James. And he had even critical judgments about James and James' understanding of Peirce. Now, I think the discussion you raised depends very much on your definition of metaphysics. Because if I take what is called the pragmatist maxim in Peirce, you could interpret the pragmatist maxim of Peirce as a kind of anti-metaphysics program. When he says the meaning of a concept is just the sum of all its potential, actual or potential practical effects, you could take it as a very absolute critique of metaphysical or religious statements. Now you can say, well, actually, it depends on how you define practical effects. Because if we understand by practical effects just practice in the sense of what I'm doing physically here and now and so on, I think we are misunderstanding Peirce. I think it was a much broader understanding. So to some extent, you could be right. I think Peirce was interested by metaphysics. He was interested by Kant and so on. But he was very much against what I would call kind of metaphysicism. I don't know how to call it. This idea that you can have a metaphysical debate without any reference to life experience, to practice, to life, to human experience.
I think the pragmatic maxim has been investigated, has been adopted without considering the broader context of Peirce's thought. Peirce developed the pragmatic maxim in order to fit into his wider theory. And I think his metaphysics concerns were driven by scientific insights at the time, scientific insights of the theory of relativity and of Darwin's evolutionary theory. And he was trying to bridge the discussion of metaphysics with science, which is why he heavily relies on theories about the philosophy of science to kind of incorporate the two. But yeah, anyways, yeah.
Thanks a lot. I see we have 3 hands up, so I will move that on. John, because you have asked a question before, let me just pick now. Julie Garnier, do you want to ask your question? And I'll pick you later, John.
Yes, hi. Thank you for this presentation. My name is Julie Garnier, and I study labor relations. So I'm quite interested in pragmatism because I think it opens up a lot of our studies, and I do want to include power relations in that mixed. And now I see that there's also a critical pragmatism kind of stream of research, and I'm wondering if that new qualification of critical is it important in pragmatism, or if the pragmatist thoughts also include power relations from start? That would be my question.
Well, if we speak of classical pragmatism, let us say Peirce, James, Dewey, and Mead, it's very different for the different pragmatist thinkers. I think that Peirce was not really critical, political. It's not his topic. He's not quite interested in it, and he's more a logician, a philosopher of science, a philosopher of knowledge. To some extent, we could say a metaphysicist. I agree with the previous intervention. While, for example, Dewey was an activist, a political activist. He was very much committed in the support of trade unions, in the support of social and legal and political support to immigrants, and in the critique of capitalism. He has writing, I mentioned profitability, but he has writings about, so that he supported, for example, the political program of a party which tried to present a third candidate, non-Republican, non-Democrat, in a presidential election. And that program included the nationalization, the socialization of basic means of production. I think it mentioned oil and steel production and the basic industries. And Dewey is very clear about the fact that there can be no democracy without the practice of inquiry, but there can be no practice of inquiry without what he calls democracy, which is anything but formal democracy. He says, no, democracy is not the voting right. It's much more than that. In the capacity of people, the debate he has with Walter Lippmann, he is very clear about the fact that if you want to develop democracy, it means that the public constitutes itself as the public of democracy, which is not immediate and spontaneous. It requires a lot of historical, political, cultural conditions to reach it. So I think critical pragmatism today is the normal continuation of this Deweyan and maybe median tendency. James was also had writings maybe on different topics. James was very critical of American imperialism. I think he wrote more on international geopolitics and the war in the Philippines and so on, the war to Spain. I don't know if James was so much interested in the internal politics of the United States, but definitely Dewey was.
Yeah, thank you. That's was also my intuition, but I will dig into what you said more about because and John Commons also was also part of that
And
subgroup.
he was a strong critic of Taylorism for obvious reason. If you know, if you look at the pragmatist ideas, it's obvious that the pragmatists had to be against Taylorism. But his critics of Taylorism go, to my mind, go much further than just criticizing Taylorism. They sketch, they outline a more general critique of the heteronomy of work, a defense of autonomy, the autonomy of actors, autonomy of workers, and so on.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot. Julie also shared some references in the chat that you might want to check out. Pascal, you had your hand raised up, and now it's gone. I'll give you a moment to react, else we continue with the next hand up, and that is John. All right, John, you go ahead.
You're on mute, John.
Yeah, I know. I think it's okay now. Well, Philippe, since you have been writing with François Corinne, I just wonder, could you explain the key differences between, you could say, the pragmatist view and then François Corinne view as expressed in ventriloquism? You know, the ventriloquist view on the communicative constitution of organizations. I mean, are there key differences, or is it the same thing?
I think it's very close. I don't know if it is exactly the same thing, but maybe I would say in François' work, maybe Peirce is much more present than Dewey, and the more social or political dimension of pragmatic thought, particularly, for example, about democracy, plays a less major role in François' work than the basic philosophy of Peirce about meaning, about signs, about language, discourse, and so on. But it's just an issue, I think, of focus. He focuses more in this aspect of pragmatism. I think with pragmatism, it's unavoidable because pragmatism is a very wide range of interests. Because there are many pragmatic thinkers, I mentioned the four classical. I mentioned Follett, who is not strictly a pragmatist, but she is a kind of fellow traveler of pragmatism. I could mention Jane Addams, and then what we call new pragmatists, such as Hilary Putnam, Hans Joas, and so on. So it's a very wide range of interests. And of course, each of us having their own topics, their own research focus, we are going to, the pragmatists say the theories are just tools. So we have to do our market, to look for theoretical and theories and concepts which are useful for the type of social transformation we want to generate, we want to produce. And that's the case with pragmatist ideas. We have to go and look for what can I use? And François did it, more with Peirce.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. So we have another question in the chat. Sandy Sun, do you want to ask your question? Else I will read it out.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Hello. Yeah, thank you. I'm the first year PhD. I do my qualitative approach research, just started for the supply chain related management background. So I'm following New Scholar Wagner. My question is linked to the the last session. So I read the paper about how to justify the interpretive approach when doing the research. Right now, I heard the term like you just mentioned, no overlooking observer and immersed in the practice. So I got a bit confused about the difference between this pragmatism and also phenomenologist, the perspective. What's the difference between these two when I do the qualitative approach research? Thank you.
Well, I think it's very different types of philosophies, though there are convergences, possibilities of. Now I'm working with colleagues on embodied sense making. We go back to Carl Weick, and embodied sense making, in situ sense making, and we think that our research is based on a field, on the intervention of special police force in the Bataclan, the Paris theater terrorist coup. We have a very privileged access to the police special force. We could interview them, but also observe their training and participate in several of their activities. And what struck us is that there is no separation between space and time. They are permanently judging space through time and time through space, which is also true to my mind in the many of the case studies of Carl Weick, such as Mangold, for example, in which there is a permanent integration of the spatial and temporal dimensions of the sense-making process. This is a convergence with phenomenology. That's why I mention it. Merleau-Ponty work, Merleau-Ponty insists on embodied thought, which is very close to embodied sense-making, and the integration between space and time. Now, from a more general point of view, I think that phenomenology is really philosophical. I don't know if, well, some organization scholars such as Jürgen Sandberg or are applying phenomenological ideas to organization research, but I think that their starting point, the starting point of phenomenology, is probably much more purely philosophical than the starting point of pragmatism, which is really socio-historical. What is happening? How can we face what we are facing, the challenges we are facing? But again, I think there is no basic contradiction between those philosophies. They are different levels with different focuses.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, please go ahead. Ask a follow-up question.
Yeah, thank you. I just think I mean, for the pragmatism, if I use this view to do the data analysis, because the view is to encourage to do the participate analysis. It's similar to the paper I read from the interpretive approach to do the data analysis. So I'm confused from the data analysis point of view. These two approaches are same or not?
I think that neither of the two approaches says very precise things about data analysis. I don't think that phenomenological philosophers said anything concrete and practical about data analysis. It was not there. And I know that pragmatist philosophers didn't say much either about data analysis. I think that apart from saying what I said, the methodological opportunism, they don't go very much into concrete. And I think that data analysis depends very much on the type of research you have, the type of situation you are analyzing, and the type of, I go back to my CEO saying, congratulations. If you do discourse analysis, you must be very, very careful to take into account situations. Because I would say, and that I think François Coren would say that too, situations speak as much as human actors and as much as scholars. The situation tells us a lot of, without words, but tells us a lot of things. So if data analysis is not very much careful about how can I give an account, a practical account of the situation and the transformation, the permanent transformation of the situation, I may miss what is essential in organization research. The point to know if it is qualitative, quantitative, and so on, I think it's a false debate. I think we can need, in this methodological opportunism, we can need quantitative research, quantitative tools. We can need qualitative tools. We can need historical techniques of analysis. Recently, I'm trying to publish a paper, it's very difficult, in which I analyze the long trajectory of a company I have been knowing for 30 years. And my reviewers tell me, well, fine, but did you hold a diary in your research? How many interviews did you make? Which is a nonsense. If I make a historical analysis over 30 years of the becoming and transformation of a company, what kind of diary would have had 30 years ago? What kind of counting interviews would be meaningful? You see what I mean? I mean that we should not try to categorize data analysis and methods. We should be very careful about what kind of problem, what kind of situation, and how can I try to produce, to generate some kind of practical understanding which allows to transform the situation.
Great, thank you. There was a question asked before, and I feel it's very relevant to the topic of today's webinar. Helen actually left in the meantime, but still I would like to ask the question. She wrote that it says, seems the application of pragmatic logic seems very anthropocentric, human-centered. It is therefore still unclear to me how exactly it will drive change for sustainability-related issues such as climate change. I think you talked about this a bit, but maybe you can highlight a bit more how pragmatism is more than just anthropocentric.
I think it's anything but anthropocentric, because I just give two examples.
Yeah.
First, Peirce's theory of sign. Peirce tells us there's a sign is a kind of independent being. It moves. It transforms. The sign by itself is performative. Be it conveyed by human beings, human discourses or not. He even invents the concept of quasi-mind, and he gives the example of crystallization, the physical phenomenon of forming crystals. And he says there, in crystallization, there is a kind of meaning-making of, even if there is no human beings, no interpreter, no, but well, quasi-minds. He speaks of quasi-minds. Okay, the second example is a book I mentioned before. It's Knowing and the Known, authored by Dewey and Bentley. If you read Knowing and the Known, you will read a kind of anti-anthropocentric, could I call it, manifesto. It's a kind of anti-anthropocentric manifesto. Because they say, as I explained, the transactional inquiry is they compare it with the theory of fields in physics, electromagnetic fields. And they say it's all kinds of beings moving around. And there is emergence because the movement of each component of the field has an influence on the general movement of the field, but the general movement of the field retroacts on the movement of the particle or the components. And in that, they say there can be human beings, there can be concepts, there can be objects, animals, and so on. So I think it's knowing and unknown. I would qualify it as a kind of anti-anthropocentric manifesto. The concept of transaction is completely non-anthropocentric.
Okay.
It's the emergence from a complex system. They use the word emergence to analyze it.
Thank you. I see that Fidelis has raised his hand a time. Do you want to ask a question?
Oh yeah. Thank you so much, Philippe, for this lovely presentation. I'm a PhD student in Newcastle University here, and then I'm studying organizational learning. So I came across a lot of Dewey's work, especially in the social perspective. But my question is generally to try to find out what is pragmatist position when it comes to extraction, because, for example, Dewey's transaction approach, what is pragmatist view when it comes to extraction? Because ecology, we're talking about ecology and pragmatist approach to sustainability. So I want to see the relations in terms of extraction. But then I also have another question to look at what do you see in the future in terms of pragmatist approach and critical realism view? Because for me, it's like critical realism is somewhere pragmatist, depending on how deep you go. But also then I'm concerned about ethics, which seems to be a bit challenged with pragmatist approach to things emerging from things that we don't know. For example, the relations with nature. You also mentioned Weber's view of rationalism, because when we rationalize things, idealism, then we don't know where we are heading to. Can pragmatists help us in that? Because my supervisor is in that position, it's a pragmatist, but then I'm concerned that I need to see what its position is in terms of extraction, because things that we do is basically based on that. So I wanted to get your opinion in that, and then so that to see whether I'm within the pragmatist position or critical realism position, basically. Thank you.
What do you mean by extraction?
Extraction in terms of transaction with nature, transactions with material stuff. I think if you see transaction in terms of oligarchic view of humans and their relations with material, things like technology, for example.
Well, I think to start with, and I think that would be a convergence between pragmatism and Bruno Latour, for example. Maybe that's why Bruno Latour spoke more and more at the end of his life of Dewey and pragmatism. I think that from a pragmatist point of view, you must drop the concepts of materiality, non-materiality, and so on. Situations are, by definition, material and non-material, and human and non-human. And it means that, to my point of view, it means that those concepts of materiality versus, for example, humanity or social, material versus social or material versus human, those analytical categories of material and so on, if you can never really instantiate them in empirical approaches, they are useless. It's the pragmatist maxim of Peirce. And honestly, I read a lot of social materiality papers and so on. And so far, I didn't find any social materiality paper in which what is called social is only social, in which there is no materiality, and what is called material is purely material. So what are those categories? To my mind, they are useless because, so to speak of, I would rather speak of, because there is a kind of circularity in the pragmatist inquiry. And I think that Dewey, for example, was quite aware of it. On one side, we say, as pragmatists, the inquiry is open to the world. There is no ontological boundary. There may be operational, methodological boundaries. I decide that the situation is bounded in that way. From a spatial point of view, from a temporal point of view, I don't, but I know that at any moment in inquiry, my definition of boundaries can be, can fail. And the process of my inquiry, so I think that, and this is a kind of unavoidable devil, that we know that we cannot inquire without defining segmentation, boundaries, and so on. But we must be very much conscious that those are tools to study a situation, to try to move in a situation, to transform the situation. And that we should be ready to drop our boundaries and segmentation and so on, if required, at any moment in our inquiry. So I think that you cannot inquire if you don't shut. I go back to the picture of the closet I showed at the end of my presentation. You have to shut some doors. You cannot do it without shutting some doors. But you must be aware that you shut those doors and maybe it's wrong. Maybe it's a mistake.
Philippe, we also have to shut another door here, and that is the door in time, so to say. We are getting to the end. I do want to ask Visa to ask the very last question, because I had said that you could ask your question. Visa, do you want to ask the very last question?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Professor, thank you so much for that very interesting introduction into pragmatism. So, I mean, so this is my first, interaction with what pragmatism looks like. And I come from a management consulting background. I'm a PhD student from India right now. And I felt that it's consultants do the practical example which you showed about pragmatism in the hospital case. It seemed very similar to how a consultant approaches a consulting problem, management consulting problem. So would you say that it's pragmatism in practice is similar to that, similar to management consulting, or it's like, minus the theory part, of course, I'm asking.
Well, I would be very happy if consultants did this type of work. I'm not sure it's always the case, because I think that for practical and for economic reasons, consultants tend to try to apply predefined models.
Right.
And I see, for example, in the case of hospitals, there is actual, and nowadays in France, the fashion, I think not only in France, but the fashion of lean management in hospitals. And I think there is a preconceived model of what lean management is, with what the consultants call business process models. Which are more or less standardized. And those preconceived models are quite contradictory.
They come with their own constrictions.
So the pragmatist approach says, Follett speaks of the law of the situation. You have to start from the situation.
So
And from your experience, because you don't, it's not Descartes, you don't start from a white sheet. So you start from the situation to which you apply your experience, aware that maybe your experience should be partly questioned. But you have no choice. You have to start from your experience. But I think that is the problem of consultants, to have preconceived. Many
So, but
preconceived.
root cause analysis, things like root cause analysis are somewhat closer, I would say, to this in case.
Root cause analysis?
Root cause analysis, the root cause analysis models which are, I mean, I'm just asking. And I just had a follow-up question on the complex adaptive systems. You had touched upon the complex adaptive systems. Are there any resources on, linking complexity with pragmatism? Which
yeah, maybe some consultants are more in the tradition of analyzing complex systems. I think that there is that tradition of Tavistock Institute and so on, taking into account, considering complex system, open complex system, because complex system can be
closed
very
or open,
cognitivist, closed systems and so on, but also the tradition of open complex systems, and that can be very close to pragmatism. Yes.